you, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. My name is Satish Tadikonda. I'm a senior lecturer in Harvard Business School, and I'm joined by my colleague, Nikhil Bhojwani, managing partner of Recon Strategy, and a distinguished list of panelists here. We'll get to their intros in just a moment. But this is part of our continuing webinar series on GenAI in healthcare. And we'll be doing a deep dive into scaling AI for hospitals and healthcare providers today. This is session number 4, and we welcome all of you, and we look forward to a very engaging conversation today. And before we begin, maybe we do a quick round of intros here, and I have Dr. Marc Succi from Mass General Hospital, Brigham Hospital, Alex Momeni from General Catalyst, Frederik Bay from Adobe, and Tim Driscoll from Boston Children's Hospital. Marc, would you give a brief intro, followed by Alex, Frederik, and Tim?
Sure. Great to be here, and thanks for having me. Apologize if there's any noise in the background. I'm a radiologist at Mass General Brigham. I'm an entrepreneur, an inventor in a past life, and have a small research lab here. Doing a lot of business and medicine operations, and recently generative AI research publications, benchmarking it for clinical decision support. Mostly the associate chair of innovation at the healthcare system. 3 days a week, I'm in the tech transfer office. And what I do there is help strategize where to invest funds and money into new thematic areas of healthcare, like generative AI or gene and cell therapy, and things like that. And it's great to be here. So I'll throw it to the next panelist.
Alex?
Thank you so much for having me today. So Alex Momeni, I'm a partner at General Catalyst, which is a multi-stage venture firm, and we have a pretty large healthcare and life sciences practice, investing from pre-seed all the way to pre-IPO. My background is in operating and in research, so spent some time doing applied research in machine learning and healthcare at Stanford for a bit, and then was fortunate enough to be one of the early employees at a business called Nabla, which is in the scribing space today. And now at General Catalyst, spend all my time leading our investing at the intersection of healthcare, life sciences, and artificial intelligence. Excited for the conversation.
Frederik?
Yeah, thank you for having me here as well. And sorry about the voice. I've had a little bit of sickness over the last few days, but shouldn't hopefully be a problem. So I am general manager of healthcare at Adobe, where I lead the strategy for the business and engage with many of the largest customers in the healthcare space across the US. Prior to my career at Adobe, where I spent about 5 years building up the healthcare business, I was at Pfizer for about a decade in various strategy roles, ending up with leading strategy for the biopharma business at Pfizer.
And Tim?
Hi, I'm Tim Driscoll. Thanks so much for having me. I am the Senior Director of Technology Strategy and Innovation at Boston Children's Hospital. I co-chair Data Governance Council, and I also lead our enterprise AI adoption and intelligent automation, along with the responsible adoption of large language solutions.
Thank you. And looking forward to a very widespread and sort of getting a perspective on all what you respectively are doing at your institutions. And before we get going, I wanted to just give you a recap of what we have done in previous webinars. If you recall, those who have attended the webinar, we set out to answer these 2 questions. If AI can help improve healthcare and save millions of lives, and assuming it's yes, then how do we do it? How do we scale it? And how do we deploy it? So answering those 2 questions, obviously, can it? The answer was not surprisingly yes. And when you think about how to deploy it, one of the careful things that we need to consider is about using it responsibly, right? Not only from a regulatory or ethical perspective, but in order for AI to be effectively scaled, then we need to do so responsibly. With that context, what we also set about secondly doing is establishing a framework for a number of use cases across a range of settings, right? If you look at the columns on the right here, we looked at use cases within the measure, decide, and execute aspect of it across a number of domains. And each of these domains, while they are at a different stages of maturity, the key theme we took away was that its use of AI is accelerating across all these domains, right? With that framework in mindset, one of the key things that we did realize while the adoption of AI is increasing, it is important to recognize that each of these domains require their own deep dive and looking at things in having their own specific consideration that we needed to think about. With that in mind, we had webinar 2, which focused on biopharma, webinar 3, which focused on digital health, and we have arrived at webinar 4 now, which is focused on health systems. With that in mind, I'd like to open up and ask Nikhil to come and set up a landscape on where AI can be used in hospitals.
Sure, thank you, Satish. So, as we did in the case of biopharma and digital health, we try to lay out some sort of framework that covers potential use cases. And, with biopharma, we used a value chain to look at applications. With digital health, we looked at a set of applications across all sectors of healthcare. And I was thinking about what's the right framework to use for hospitals and health systems, and figured that one good way to look at this would be to just look at the IT platform of a health system and think about all the components in that IT platform, because that is where you could imagine AI being used. Now, some of these are operational, some are clinical, and so on. But you can see that there's applications across all of these. I'll just touch on some of them briefly. So the core, obviously, of what the health system does is clinical work. And so you have IT systems and therefore the opportunity for AI in those systems that support care delivery and clinical management. But most hospitals are not just doing clinical work. They're also doing training or education and research. And so there's a bunch of applications there where you could use AI and GenAI. You've then got direct interaction with patients. So when we talk of health systems, we're not just talking about hospitals. Certainly hospitals interact with patients, but then you've got outpatient settings, you've got patients that you've taken risk on, etc. There's all kinds of ways in which you need to interact with patients. Again, another place where you could apply AI. And then all of us know that as you think about each of these things, there's a support around it. So you've got to manage the revenue cycle. That's one of the places where we're seeing early application of AI, whether it is in managing prior authorization requests, etc. But also interoperability across the system between your organization and other organizations. And then, like any other large organization, you've got the infrastructure to manage people and general functions like health, like people and finance and so on. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but if anyone's really interested, you could always take a screenshot of this from the recording when it's put up. But in every one of these buckets, you could imagine a whole set of use cases that are very specific. So for instance, in clinical, just take all of those different service lines under core, and every one of them, you could imagine different applications of healthcare. Think of the ancillary functions like labs and imaging and so on. And so essentially, my point here is not so much to go through each one of these in a detailed listing, but to highlight the fact that the hospital and the health system is a highly complex entity with all kinds of places where AI can be applied and used to either augment or substitute or support what humans are doing. So with that, Satish, I'll hand it back and love to hear what the other panelists think about where the real applications are.
Thank you, Nikhil. And the first question to all the panelists is, what are the main opportunities you are seeing for AI, particularly Gen AI, in the hospital ecosystem, right? And maybe, Marc, you want to take start with your opinions on this?
Sure. I think there's quite a few opportunities. The way we look at it here, Mass General Brigham, is low risk all the way through high risk, and then timelines with both of those. So low risk, 6 months to 2 or 3 years towards implementation and really adoption, more importantly. Things that Nikhil was mentioning, so contact center, revenue cycle, coding, prior auth, all of that is being implemented now. If not in a beta test, it's being implemented in practice at Mass General Brigham. The more disruptive concepts for healthcare, like clinical workflow, true decision support, meaning actual diagnostic support, not only to physicians, but to PAs and NPs that often do a lot of the emergency care, is going to take quite a bit longer. And that's something we're actively researching and testing a few things. But the technology might get there in a few years based on our research and publications, but true adoption at somewhere like MGB, where there's 60,000 employees and the vast majority are in community clinics, not necessarily a big research hospital, is going to take probably 10 or 15 years. So we're really focused on the more immediate workflow, lower risk, generative AI implementations right now. And the only other thing I'll say before moving on to the next panelist is that we do want to make sure whatever we implement is equitable, enhances the patient experience, obviously, and ideally addresses some element of healthcare worker burnout, lowers costs and improves value in some way. So those are all the aims that we're trying to align when we test and implement these new opportunities.
You're muted, Satish.
Sorry about that. I'll hand it over to Alex, but I just wanted to expand, double click on what Marc said, which is, they seem to be focusing much more on sort of process related and automation at the more back office level. Is that a true summary, Marc, before you get to more predictive or predictive analytics or things like that?
Yeah, I think for the short term, considering the risk benefit, that's the stuff we're testing now. In parallel, of course, we have the labs like mine doing the research on clinical decision support algorithms, but understanding that timeline is far longer than what you just said, the back office implementation.
Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, so I think just to level set, at the end of the day, AI, whether it's more traditional AI, generative AI, is really just a technology trying to solve a problem, right? And so when we look at this new wave of technology, there's basically 3 ways in which health systems, hospitals can use AI. One is for innovation, right? And the way you think about innovation is, what are things that just did not exist before, but that this technology can enable? A good example of this is Hippocratic AI, which is building an AI clinician that can really, serve to leverage the workforce very, very significantly, and potentially, provide an AI clinician to every patient out there in the United States. The second is transformation, right? How do we take, a set of people and processes and then flesh in this technology in the right way, rethink the way we do things to unlock real leverage for health systems and hospitals? Now, you will have all seen scribing as a new trend, which obviously delivers some form of efficiency, but scribing's real opportunity today, from our vantage point, is rethinking that entire workflow from scribing to CDI to revenue cycle management, and compressing that at the point of care. And then the final, sort of vector is leveraging this technology to do the things that we already do, but do them in a far more efficient way. And instead of managing 50, 60 different vendors, actually leveraging one API and integrating that into, clinical workflows to deliver value. I just want to make one comment, which is around this whole tension between back office administrative versus clinical. So if you think about AI, basically can provide three levers. One is, on the administrative stack and financial stack. One is on sort of the clinical stack, and the other is on the workforce stack. We actually already have very good regulatory frameworks on the clinical side. The FDA has had frameworks out since 2019, and so we have a pretty good understanding of how to evaluate and regulate AI in clinical decision support, in clinical workflows, and so the question now is just how the regulator decides to adapt its existing framework to this new type of AI, which adds some challenges given its stochastic nature, but ultimately requires just an extension, right? So I actually feel like the timeline to have clinical AI will be, in the GenAI sense, will be much shorter than people expect, given we're really starting from a great baseline here.
Well, thanks, Alex. I do want to expand on one topic. You recently made an investment in a health system, and you spoke about having common interfaces and trying out some of these new technologies within that hospital system. Could you expand how you're thinking about it in the context of both your investments in the space as well as where you see the future of application of GenAI or AI in that context?
Yeah, of course. So just to level set, we have just signed an LOI, and the road ahead of us is long. So we have by no means closed that transactions. We are, however, very excited by the transaction, and part of the reason we are doing this is of course to try to work hand in hand with folks at Summa to leverage technology to solve some of the greatest challenges that a health system like theirs may be facing, or create the right leverage. So I can't comment specifically on the transaction. I'm not directly involved, and I can't comment directly on how we will use AI. But AI is technology, and given the core part of the thesis of pursuing this is really working hand in hand with them to leverage technology to transform the business. We will obviously be thinking carefully about how to use AI in a responsible way in that setting.
So let's just say you invested in Hippocratic and you invested in Summa. So, and leave it at that. Right.
Thanks, Alex. Over to you, Tim. If you can give your perspective on, where you see opportunities for using AI, particularly GenAI.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, well, there are virtually limitless use cases for AI, more specifically GenAI, to tackle on the operational, clinical, and research fronts. This includes everything from capacity predictions to synthesizing patient data. Right now, we are actively deploying operations use cases primarily, but investigating clinical use cases where there's a human in the loop. A few key areas that we're focused on is in research and education. It can speed up literature reviews, help analyze qualitative data, even act as an interactive tutor. We have a tool that we're working on called MedTutor, which is a platform to train the next generation of clinicians using GenAI. You're also looking at how GenAI can enhance clinical decision support by pulling together all types of patient data to give our clinicians deep insights right when they need them. So this can help us improve diagnosis, personalized treatments, catch issues sooner. Another area where there'll be a great impact is operational efficiency. And I think that's kind of the theme that we've already heard. Solutions that use AI to optimize capacity planning, to better predict and manage patient flow. We're leveraging it to streamline our finance and management processes. This leads to significant time and cost savings. It allows our staff to focus on higher value tasks and function at the top of their license and reduce burnout. Additionally, things like automation of time-consuming tasks like clinical documentation, medical coding audits, so our clinicians and staff spend more time with their patients and families. And we're also exploring how GenAI-powered platforms can make it easier for nurses to access clinical policies and protocols with our Policy Stat application, which is a fully natural language conversation policy reader. But critically, we do recognize that realizing this potential requires responsible AI development. So it's important to establish a clear governance structure, invest in secure access to tools for our researchers and innovators, and ultimately our goal is to leverage this technology to provide the best possible care for our children and families we serve.
Thanks, Tim. It looks like you have gone all in on across the various aspects of adopting it. Could you give us some flavor of how big this effort is, or like either in terms of people or in terms of how you're thinking about this from a whole institutional perspective at Children's?
It's tough to put a number on it because everyone in the organization is fractionally a part of it, right? So there's a portion of everyone who's going to take part in this, but we're genuinely excited about the potential of GenAI, and we're building the foundation off of a decade worth of work that comprises our AI portfolio. With the advancements in GenAI, it will revolutionize the way that we deliver care and run the hospital. So we've developed a comprehensive strategic approach to our AI portfolio, guided by a clear set of objectives and principles. Our high-level objectives include demonstrating AI's impact on care quality, generating financial ROI, responsibly stewarding AI to ensure its ethical and sustainable use, and then driving efficiency and expertise in the way that we're improving things. But underpinning these objectives are the key principles around diversity, fairness, accountability, and robust governance. So we're committed to developing AI that is inclusive, transparent, and grounded. In terms of the specific areas where we're seeing AI driving value across multiple domains, on the clinical front, we're exploring use cases like models for diagnostic support. This includes leveraging things like our CRISP platform, which is the Children's Hospital Research Integration Service. And that enables an AI processing pipeline to incorporate radiology models in a frictionless fashion, so the data processing happens behind the scenes and on demand. Now, that has a handful of people working on it, and they're not necessarily in the AI department, but you get a sense that there are pockets of innovation happening throughout the enterprise, where there are literally hundreds of people, whether it's in an operations capacity or research capacity or just pure innovation. So it really does run the gamut. But we are developing tools to synthesize complex patient data and make clinical protocols more accessible for our frontline staff. Across these efforts, we're taking a phased approach, building foundational capabilities, defining prioritization frameworks, and then rapidly scaling high-impact use cases. So it's pretty active across the board.
So, Tim, there was a question which came up, which I think probably just touches upon one of the items, and one of the attendees is curious if you're using synthetic data in training as well as in addressing compliance.
So on the clinical front, we're not actively doing anything with synthetic data at this point that I'm aware of. The focus is really on building solutions that are going to leverage our actual patient data. But there have been scenarios, where we're creating intelligent automations where we have had to generate synthetic data. Something like resume scanning, where we're looking to align our salary bands for the hospital last year. We ended up creating hundreds of thousands of records of synthetic data of resumes just to be able to goose the models in a way that was meaningful, so it could do the data extraction that we needed to.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. And Frederik, as GM of the healthcare division of Adobe, what are you seeing in terms of level of adoption or different use cases from your perspective within the hospital?
So I'm going to take a slightly different and narrow view and focus on Nikhil's top box of patient engagement, which is mainly where we play when it comes to working with healthcare businesses. And I see a lot of interest there and a lot of opportunity. In the short term, it's really mostly about overcoming some traditional barriers to adoption that we've seen. Typically when you look at hospital systems, they have limited digital engagement or digital marketing expertise, limited ability to create the content needed for the engagement. And generative AI and AI in general can make that dramatically easier and dramatically cheaper. And that's where we're mainly playing at the moment in terms of helping with conversational interfaces and a lot of our tools, so they're much easier to adopt. And with content, obviously, leveraging GenAI to make content creation all the way from ideation to deployment much, much easier. longer term, there is a lot of opportunity when it comes to personalized engagement at a scale that we're not able to now. Engaging in this case with patients or providers along all the stages, all the way from acquisition to scheduling to wellness management to billing in a much, much more personalized fashion and a much more effective fashion. So that we're talking about, what we're doing right now is the easier fixes, as I was saying. The other angle for Adobe is obviously around digital documents and document management. Lots of opportunities there too. As was mentioned, specifically in the terms in the context of note capturing, but I mean, in general, there's a lot of time spent on documentation and a significant opportunity to leverage AI to enable faster creation, completion of documents, or at least first drafts of those. And similarly, right, to extract insights from the enormous amount of data and number of documents that are already out there. And that's another area where we're engaging. So it's a different and narrow view, but those are the two spaces where we're seeing the most interest and activity.
And Frederik, are you doing anything? This may be, in Marc's domain, but are you seeing anything from, I know from extraction of information from documents, but also from images and things like that, radiology-based images, any such thing, any activity in that front?
Well, so we are not specifically focused on radiology. We're not focused on the clinical side. Obviously, we are doing a lot around images, tagging of images, labeling of images, and creating variants of images and so on. So it's in a very different way, but we have a lot of capabilities in that space. I'm not sure that we're ready, though, to go to the clinical side of things. We have the expertise or the inclination from a security and legal perspective.
Okay, thanks. So Nikhil, what's new and what are you seeing from your vantage point?
I've got to react. I find it really interesting, this difference between, so first of all, Frederik, thank you for raising that whole patient engagement point of view. At the end of the day, this is all about patients, right? So we can't be sitting just thinking about within the health system. But I'm really fascinated by the difference in how, Marc, you described what you're doing at Mass General, and Tim, the approach at Children's. And both of these are, marquee hospitals. Both of them have brand names to protect and great sort of concerns around risk and so on. And yet you seem to be in very different places. And I'm wondering if the two of you would, maybe Marc, since you went first last time, comment a little bit about that, because it's, as you know, I'm sort of well familiar with Mass General's MESH program and so on, and I see you guys at the cutting edge of innovation. So say more about how you're thinking about innovation and risk.
I think it's a great question, and I actually see a lot of similarities as well with Children's. And just on the brand thing, I would get in trouble by Paul Anderson if I didn't say it's Mass General Brigham. I keep forgetting. Brigham is the one we always forget, but we value them very much. The way we think about technology, and this also touches on that timeline question, is that the technology will get there. Either we will do the research or someone else will do the research and we'll license it in and validate it through our data science office. But the adoption is really the thing that matters to us. You can get stuff FDA approved, but the graveyard of FDA approved products is very large. Actually getting into patient use is a totally different question, and that's where the timeline extends as a physician. And so our approach is trying to, one, obviously benefit from implementing these tools in the revenue cycle in ambient note documentation and Epic right now. We use that, a couple of companies. And then to use those low risk touch points to socialize the broader community with these tools. Then to implement training programs and grand rounds like the seminar is doing, but also other educational touch points throughout the system. Because the fact is that we're going to have to be probably training med students and residents in AI fundamental curriculums, if not now, very soon. And so our approach is to use these low risk tools to benefit ourselves, but also to socialize the concept of AI. Because remember, right, we have a lot of early career physicians and healthcare providers, 60,000 employees, many that will be excited to use these tools. the vast majority have been practicing for 20, 30, 40 years in the community, using a stethoscope and maybe an electronic medical record in the last 10 years. So it's a totally different way to convince that population. Similar to children's, I think we're investigating the use of true clinical decision support algorithms, diagnostics, pathology, radiology. Those aren't, in our view, ready for prime time, but we do deploy them occasionally in shadow modes, which I think other institutions do, and have a select beta test of radiologists or pathologists use those tools and collect data and then go back and revise it, but that's a years-long process.
I would add to that I see it similar to Marc, that I think that there are more similarities than differences. The real place where we're having an impact is on the operations use cases. So when you get into RevCycle, when you get into automation of kind of routine tasks, that's the place where we're able to actively deploy now and create engagement. And so really most of the clinical is on the research front. We're definitely seeing, some younger providers that are using some of these tools to at least come up with ideas for how they're going to assess differential diagnosis or something like that. Maybe not use it in the actual course of treatment. One of the things that we realized early on was that some institutions were just shutting off access to things like ChatGPT. And we decided not to do that because we know that people would find their way to it anyway, and there's always the potential for there being some kind of data leakage. So we aggressively moved to actually stand up a solution that we called Internal GPT, which is a Microsoft Azure OpenAI API hosted environment where we've essentially built our own ChatGPT. It's not fine-tuned on any of our patient data at this point or anything like that, but it allows us to have a playground for all employees to go to and start to learn more about what a large language model is, how do you interact with it, introduce patient data, test the capabilities and limitations of it. And that goes hand in hand with the broader education. So similarly, once again, I think that we see this as a multi-year effort in educating people on how these tools can be used, getting them up to speed on capabilities, limitations, innovations on where they can start using it in a way that we maybe haven't uncovered. So all of these things work in concert. But I do think that the clinical use cases that we will be pursuing will have a human in the loop. They will be in these smaller populations of beta testers, of people that truly understand what they should or shouldn't be doing with it. But I think it's very much a similar approach.
Thank you. And Satish, you asked me what we are seeing from our perspective. I can tell you what I'm struggling with, and I'd love to have the panel jump in on it, which is, the boundaries between foundational models and applications. And hospitals are being inundated by vendors hawking all kinds of solutions across the board, across that landscape that I showed. And Alex, I'd be really interested in hearing from you as an investor, how you think about the stack and where to play and who should play and where who's going to win.
Why don't you tell me so I can go invest there? I think there's two ways of thinking about the stack, right? So there's like sort of the bottom of the stack, model layer, all the way to the top of the stack, which is the application layer. I think things are very fluid in that world. We also, recognize that companies like OpenAI or Mistral or today, known for being model companies, but the reality is they're all evolving into becoming product companies where they're building tooling, they're building applications to showcase the capabilities. And so ChatGPT today, ultimately is more of a product than it is a model. People get usage out of it and utility out of it on a day-to-day basis. So I would expect that to stabilize over time, and value will accrue to the model layer to a certain extent as they start building some of these tools and sort of showcasey products on top, which will take away a lot of the value from the thin layer application layer companies. On the application layer, if you're thinking about the stack more as in like the healthcare IT stack across the EMR to the RCM folks, I think there's two things, right? One is we expect there to be some level of consolidation in the stack, right? And sort of the death of the point solution. The reason being that the teams that will be able to execute well on product here will be able to leverage generative AI as not only an effective wedge into a workflow, but as a way to quickly expand across the workflow, moving from, from coding to CDI to scribing or vice versa. It doesn't really make sense anymore to have 5 different tools for something that one business can do, leveraging the same data. So that's one thing, and the reality is the starting point is a little bit irrelevant. The velocity of product execution is going to be more important there, and that those will be the folks that win. I think the second thing, Nikhil, is healthcare is very fragmented and different, right? And so certain dynamics may play out in the outpatient market, which will not play out in the inpatient market, because ultimately the problems that we're trying to solve are slightly different. And so there may be some interesting market segments where the EMRs still reign supreme, and in others where there's actually an opportunity to build companies that can not only consolidate the stack but end up becoming the ultimate system of record, right? And so we're looking at these dynamics very carefully and trying to map out how we think the influence dynamics will play out over the next 3 to 5 years, and therefore have a point of view on where the value will accrue.
Great. And I know I'm supposed to be commenting, but I'm just so excited to hear from these folks. Frederik, given what Alex just said, I mean, where is there room for someone like Adobe to carve out a space that's not then eaten up by either the platform or the foundational model or the EMR or the other sort of enterprise software folks?
Well, I would say we are an enterprise software company to start with. I mean, I think the way we look at it is, AI is a starting point. And the way that we're building or we're leveraging AI, building our AI models is as part of our tools, right? At least at the moment, right? An image generation model, an image generating AI we see that as a starting point. Maybe that will change in the future, but typically you'll generate something that you might then modify in another tool, and ultimately, like Photoshop or whatever it might be, or you might leverage it as part of that tool to alter an image, right? So we see the model as a starting point. We have created an image generation model because we needed one that was safe from a compliance and legal perspective. But that's really what we see. We see it as integrating AI into our tools to make it easier to automate tasks, to augment what you can do, to democratize access to those tools by making it easier for non-experts to engage with them. And I think, we'll see how things evolve. Right now, we're not trying to compete with the EMRs of the world and many of the other systems within a hospital. That may change over time, right? Really, there is a big gap in terms of engagement, in terms of how well that works for patients and others, and that is where we play. That is where we play very well. So we are building on top of EMRs, building on top of other systems, and integrating with them, to be able to help effectively engage with patients, engage with providers, and engage with others.
Thanks, Frederik. Before we jump into the second part of this conversation, I had one question. It seems like there is this eternal conflict, right? You want to democratize access to a lot of tools and applications, and Nikhil spoke about the number of vendors coming in. You want to, Marc and Tim, you want to probably promote like grand scale experimentation. You want to allow a lot of your clinicians to experiment with these different types of tools. How do you put the guardrails, to make sure that experimentation occurs at scale, yet you are trying to have control all these vendors or access to these tools and technologies? Maybe I'll start with you, Marc.
Yeah, I think Tim mentioned several of them. Something we're doing similar is the AI playground, where we have a firewall GPT that you can then go and train on, test stuff on, talk, with ChatGPT, where none of the data goes back to OpenAI on the MGB VPN or on site. So stuff like that is really important to control the environment, right? And give people options to use this stuff that they're hearing about. Otherwise, you very well might have someone who is in a community and saying, okay, let me ask ChatGPT about this patient, copy and paste a clinical note in there. Could have happened. So I think investing in providing the tools itself. And the second one is an AI governance committee, which is primarily run by our data science office. Various stakeholders, from physicians to financial to patient experience, because we haven't talked about the patient much, but the patient experience folks, and a system for evaluating homegrown and vendor algorithms, a common system that's fair and equitable for evaluating these algorithms, testing them in limited clinical deployments, evaluating that data and that feedback, and then putting them in true clinical implementation. So I think for researchers and clinicians at our institution, knowing that there is a pathway that we will evaluate and implement if it's in the best interest of the system and the patient, I think is really important, right? That it's not an opaque process on what gets chosen in regards to vendors, or if you're in a research lab in regards to the algorithm you might be developing yourself.
Thanks, Marc. So maybe we'll switch to the part 2 of our conversation about the risks within this. Nikhil, maybe you could set up some of the unique risks which are related to responsible or rather irresponsible uses of AI in hospitals, maybe,
Sure, happy to do that. And, we actually started touching on some of these topics. I mean, right up front, Tim talked a little bit about how they're thinking about responsible AI, and Marc referred to it as well. So for those of you who attended the prior sessions, you know that we've been using this framework that's from NIST, and it's used by the Responsible AI Institute and others to think about the categories of risk. And while we've introduced these, especially in webinar 1 in some detail as to what each of these are, all that I wanted to do here was to say, let's look at examples of each of these within the health system setting. So an example of where an AI is not valid or reliable, which means how it functions within the parameters of where it is supposed to function. It could be inaccuracy in notes taken by an AI scribe, and scribing is clearly one of the really hot areas right now. I mean, we just saw a bridge getting a ridiculous, or I shouldn't say ridiculous, a highly attractive valuation as a scribing company. Safety is the other one, and so that could be, if let's say you've got AI deciding the quantity of a drug to be delivered via infusion, and you actually see some of these closed loop systems already in use. They became more common during COVID, when you couldn't have a nurse. It was harder to send a nurse into the room. But what if there's an adverse event that you don't notice? The third one is around resilience when there's some external stress on the model itself. And everyone's familiar with the sepsis example, of where you had a model that seemed to work, but then when the model was placed under some stress because there was some changes to coding or the EHR, or it was applied to a different hospital, even within the same system, also using Epic, you saw that the sepsis results were no longer as predictive. Accountability and transparency, so that the way it might show up in a health system would be an AI recommendation, and then not knowing whom to blame for it if it's incorrect. Explainability and interpretability, I can't even pronounce that, is really understanding the how and why. And so there are situations where the simple fact that an AI is able to find something that a human could not is predicated on it not being able to explain it. Of course, there's lots of work being put into at least pointing to the area of an image that it is looking at, etc. But that would be another place that you'd want to be really cautious about. Privacy. I think, Mark, you already mentioned the example of where someone using OpenAI might put some patient data onto it. But the example I have here is you've got all of these vendors, and sometimes even anonymized data can be de-anonymized, as you know, once you have sufficient data and you're looking at it across systems, or you're combining data from different sources. And then the final one, I heard lots of mention of equity and so on, and the way this shows up in the NIST framework is about fairness and bias. And we know that the data being used to train some of these models is based on prior treatment patterns, which may not always be unbiased, and so could propagate through these systems. So this is just a set of examples to prompt some thinking. And in the first webinar, we talked about governance, process, and tools that the Responsible AI Institute has put together to address all of these. But what I'd really love to hear is thoughts from all of you as to how you're looking at this in real life.
I'm happy to kick off if that's helpful.
Go for it, Alex.
Good, Alex.
So I think for all the things that you just listed, one could argue that you have the same issues with a human. And so the question behind the question is, well, why don't we trust the AI? Because the AI is actually, has some issues of reliability, has some issues with bias, has some issues with accountability, so on and so forth. And why don't we trust the AI in the same way as when we press the pedal in a car, we instinctively know that the car will push forward. Now, if you ask the average human why that works, they're not going to be able to explain, all the engineering and physics which is occurring in the engine. They just know that if they click the button, the car will move forward and the engine's not going to explode, right? They trust the standards, they trust the brands, they trust the institutions that govern and regulate auto manufacturers, and they trust that there's been a process put in place over time to iterate on safety standards for these vehicles. And so I think there's three things that are important to consider when we talk about responsible AI. One is, how is the system actually being operationalized? Is this an autopilot system? Is this a co-pilot system? Is it human in the loop, human out of the loop, so on and so forth? What is the actual degree of automation that we're going after, and therefore, how can we mitigate any mistake, right? And that actually starts having huge implications on how you think about product, user experience, and user interfaces, right? Because if you're forcing someone to check box and confirm an output, it's not the same as them, just being held accountable for checking it at some point during the day, right? So there's that aspect there. I think the second aspect is, well, how are we benchmarking and evaluating these things? Like, how do we know if what they're doing is right versus wrong? Not only as we develop them, but as we put them into production and we observe them in the real world. And what are those evaluation metrics, right? And there's a lot of evidence, right, and studies which shows that, AI does well, human does well, and then the intuition is like, well, human plus AI must be great. And actually, there are many examples which show that that's not true, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. And so I think we need to do that work, right? Build the evaluations, test out the operating models. And then the third is, I think, agreeing as an industry, coming together as an industry, and thinking about what a common framework can be for our industry around these different vectors of responsibility, right? And I think that if we can come up with some industry standards, it doesn't necessarily need to be the FDA. It could be, you know, sort of extension of NIST, or even something which is set by an organization like yours, but that brings together the right stakeholders. You know, developing that type of standards infrastructure, I think, is what will give people trust in the output of the systems, right? And so we will stop asking existential questions around whether AI is biased or not, but rather be able to have conversations based on fact, and then iterate, right, towards that. Cars, you know, didn't have seatbelts. We need to get a seatbelt, right? Cars didn't have great cooling systems. Let's build a better cooling system, right, around the car. So I think just for this conversation, these are like interesting framing points, but curious to sort of get the perspectives and views of other folks on the panel.
Sure, that'd be great. Frederik, you want to get us started? You know, your perspectives on this, and maybe Marc and Tim can also talk about, you know, any examples they have on that front, you know, things which have gone right or wrong, or, you know,
Yeah.
parental or nice beneficial hallucinations or things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I absolutely agree that the same problems exist with humans, and I think it's a lot about creating trust, and transparency. So the way that we are approaching it is being very thoughtful about, you know, what data sets we use. So for example, I talked about we've created a GenAI image model. Now we have the advantage, obviously, of having the Adobe stock library, right? But we've been very careful in selecting images that don't have IP protection, instituting you know, a lot of testing around bias, you know, having clear governance processes. So having, you know, an ethics board, for example, having processes for testing, for remediation, and then being, you know, really transparent with our customers about what it is, you know, how do we collect data, what consent has been involved in that, you know, how do we develop the model, what were all the training sets involved, what were the processes that we took it through, and then in select cases, right, actually providing for some of our models indemnification for certain use cases, right, to show our trust and create trust with customers. So that this is, so I think that there are things we can definitely do as we have done as an enterprise that may be possible to replicate elsewhere, or at least part of it can be replicated elsewhere. But I agree, right, it would be good to have standards more of an industry level, to have benchmarks, to have a common way to approach things, and a common philosophy, you know, to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and what is you know, the right way to approach the risks, and you know, evolve over time to limit them.
Right, Frederik. Marc or Tim? Marc, maybe you want to get started, and then we.
Yeah, I likewise definitely agree with everything raised. Explainable, that point about explainable AI, I think is huge for physicians and healthcare providers. And I'll shout out Sinho Do, who's a researcher at MGH, who's been doing this before it was cool. And we have a couple implementations where in these test tools, for example, in radiology, where it'll be like detect a brain bleed or hemorrhage. And it'll be show when we look at a CT on the screen, we'll be able to pull up this tool. It'll tell us hemorrhage, yes or no, but then it'll explain itself. It'll say, okay, where's the hemorrhage? Why is this hemorrhage? Circle it. It's because the density of that pixel is such and such different versus the normal brain tissue versus the bone beside it. So explainable AI is huge for gaining trust amongst physicians who are the human in the loop, and Mass General Brigham will be the human in the loop forever. And I think there was a comment in the chat that was insightful that says if we have human in the loop to kind of check these AIs, eventually will that expertise be lost, right? As AIs take more and more of the clinical practice from from physicians. So I think that goes back to educating and training. And I think making sure that our healthcare providers, our physicians in med schools are trained at the same elite level, that the standards are kept high, and that they're also trained on interacting with AI. I don't think I'll take too much time because I generally have been, I agree with what the previous two panels have said, and I'll let Tim.
Actually, can I build on that a little bit and then direct to Tim? So I think the issue with human in the loop in the way that you just described it is human behavior. At some point, you're going to just check the default. And the question is, so for example, if you have an automated scribe, how much time are you really spending then to review it? And is there going to be a point where your confidence in the system grows sufficiently that you just check the box? And so, Tim, I'm curious from your perspective, how do you ensure that doesn't happen, in addition to the sort of loss of learning that Marc addressed?
So I think that, one of the things that we found with our providers when we're using ambient AI generated documentation is that, we've been running now with the nuanced stack solution for over 3 years. And, we do frequently check in with providers. We look at the amount of time they're actually taking it, at looking at the generated note and things like that, since we have access to the information. And in general, we've seen people actually continue to read the notes. And I think that, yes, it's a risk over time, but with the accountability, tied to their professional responsibility and licensure and commitment to the patient, all of that, I think, plays into the degree of seriousness. And I think that, the example that Marc was giving, where it's highlighting something that could be on radiological imaging that is imperceptible to the human eye, maybe, right? You're able to find something that you wouldn't have found otherwise. It's going beyond the human capability. It is essentially superhuman. So when it's aiding you in that way, in that it's essentially superhuman, or the natural fatigue of being a human being, et cetera, you might miss something, and it's not going to have those same kind of limitations. That I think is where it's additive. But ultimately, in the end, when it comes to standing up any type of solution, it needs to be clear, what the expectation of the provider is, what their responsibility is, and what does responsible use of that platform look like.
I'll just add, I totally 100% agree, and we have similar situations now, right? We have NPs and Ks that draft full emergency notes, and then the physician will sign off, or residents draft radiology reports, and I sign off on them. And it is that licensure, it is that the fact that someone's responsible and someone's butt is going to be on the line if there's a bad outcome, that makes you read that stuff. This has been going on for many years. It's kind of it's a standard in healthcare practice. So I do think as long as those checks and balances are in place, and for all I know, there may be a precedent-setting case on like AI misdiagnosis next year or the following years that may change this. But at least for now, someone's butt is on the line, and I think that's why that human in the loop fatigue won't be a huge issue, at least in the next few years.
Thank you, Marc, and thank you to all the panelists. We are just coming up on time. First of all, thank you for a very fascinating discussion. And before we sign off, I do want to let all the attendees know about the final capstone session of this webinar series that we're going to have at 12 noon Eastern on March 27th. The link is in the chat, so please do sign up. And once again, thank you, everyone. And thank you for all your comments, as well as from the attendees, as well as the expert opinions of the panelists. Thank you very much. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.